It is very, very difficult to simultaneously negotiate with more than 7 or 8 buyers at any given time. So again, start wide, get as many indications of interest as we possibly can, and then after the indications of the interest come in, now we go back to each buyer and we ask them if they're really serious. Say, hey, we are now going to have management meetings. So you're going to have the ability to sit down with management. You'll be able to spend a half day with them. You're going to be able to learn more about the business. It's going to cost you money. You're going to have to get on the plane, fly halfway across the world. You're going to have to hire outside advisors yourself to really invest in this process. But in order to do that, you need to increase your bid. Your bid's not sufficient. Like, you didn't win a management meeting. And so typically before management meetings, we might have 2 or 3 rounds of bidding even before we get to management meeting. And it's important for buyers to actually be able to purchase their seat, so to speak, or purchase the opportunity to sit down with management. So typically what would happen is after the indicative round, we would go to the next round. And the next round would be like, hey, we are holding management meetings 3 weeks from now in Stockholm. If you're interested in participating, please revise your bid. And we would give very similar bid instructions as we did in the indicative round, and they'd be required to tender a revised bid. And what we hope to do here is a couple of different things. You know, I like to think about the investment principle. I guess I can talk about the investment principle in a variety of different ways. One way that I think is pretty easy for everyone to grasp is, like, we as humans don't value something that we don't expend effort to get, right? Like, we don't value advice we don't pay for. People don't value concessions that come quickly. And so in the context of an M&A deal, I always get pissed when inexperienced buyers roll over too quickly, because I know from experience that, hey, this guy didn't decrease his concession sizes. He kind of went all in at once and conceded on everything he could, hope that was going to be good. But, you know, the seller, who doesn't do this every day, said, well, wait a second. They just gave us an extra $5 million. There's probably another 5 or 10 more. When I'm thinking to myself, there's probably not. So when you don't make the other side work for something, they're not going to value it. So you've got to really battle it out. The corollary to that, though, when I think about the investment principle, is very similar when you're investing in an M&A relationship. If early in the process, each individual buyer hadn't invested time, money, and effort into the relationship, and then you want to see big numbers up front, it's very easy for them to walk away. I mean, there's almost no sunk cost. It's like, hey, I spent a few hours, I read some materials, I put in a bid. Now you're giving me a big counteroffer. I don't give 2 shits, I'm out of here, right? But the more effort they expend, the more they get to know the management team, the more they're talking about it with their board, the more they put their individual name on this, the more they want it, and the more difficult it is for them to walk away. So we always have to think about a formal process in the context of investment. You want the buyers investing time, money, and effort each step of the way. The other thing you want to think about is incrementalism, right? It's, you know, somebody comes in and says, I'm going to give you 1.3 billion SEK for Nomor. I could turn around and say, hey, I want 2.5 for it. And then I find myself in a bargaining, basically positional bargaining, 1.3, 2.5, 1.5, 2.1, and we go back and forth, and typically we'll end up somewhere kind of around the middle. 9 times out of 10, folks, when they do that, end up in the midpoint. I think it's generally a losing proposition in a lot of ways for sellers when they have the ability to run a formal process, to get engaged in that sort of stuff. And as I always say, as a process setter, you want to lean into process as much as you can. On the sell side, you are a process setter. You control the process. You attempt to make sure the other side doesn't wrest control of your process. And wherever you can use process and process rules to extract resources out of the other side, you do that instead of having that sort of direct negotiation. So again, we've got this process. We start with indicative bids. What we're trying to do is we're trying to get investment by the other side, all the other buyers. We want them walking through the process, spending more time, money, and effort. And we want them to focus on slowly and incrementally increasing their bid, because, you know, listen, there's a huge gap between 1.3 billion SEK and 1.9 billion. there's not that big of a gap between 1.8 and 1.9. And so from a psychological perspective, it's ways, yeah, what's another 5 million SEK, right? Versus what's another 500 million. So incrementalism and investment. As we went through the bidding round for Nomor, we decided to bifurcate things. We started first with the strategics, and we kind of did during kind of Scandinavian summer break. So we started this process in July, and we focused first on the strategics. And the reason why we focused on the strategics is for this particular asset, we thought that the strategics were likely to be able to pay more than private equity. And we also knew that we could bring in private equity later in the process. So what we did is we started very informally. We set up an indication of interest deadline. And while we were dealing with the strategics, we had fireside chats with the private equity firms to allow them to meet management, allow them to invest in the process, allow them to not be excluded in the event we wanted to go to a broad process with both private equity and strategics. We could easily pivot and do that, but we wanted to really see where we can get with the strategics. Now, we had gone through 3 rounds of bidding prior to management meetings, and that's not typical per se, but in this particular process, that's just the way that it worked out. And so we began with 10 strategic acquirers, and by the time we were beginning to make the decision on management meetings, we were down to 4. In fact, one of the 4, ServiceMaster, was the lowest bid. And we had a lot of discussions internally as to whether or not ServiceMaster should be invited to the meeting or not. You know, ServiceMaster went from second bid to third bid, and instead of increasing the bid increment, they stood pat. They said, we're just going to reconfirm our bid, and we don't want to bid anymore until we're able to sit down with management and really think through the investment thesis. And so you're oftentimes faced with that sort of decision when you're running a process. It's important to really exercise some judgment here. And the dilemma I was faced with, on the one hand, if I got rid of ServiceMaster, I would lose a bidder, which is effectively 25% of my bidding pool at this point in time, gone, just by saying, hey, you bid didn't make it, you're not coming to management meetings. But then I had to really think hard about rewarding bad behavior, right? Like, so they just reconfirmed their bid, and I'm going to let them slide in. As I told you in session 1, information is important. It's not just what you say or what they say, it is your actions. Every action you take in an auction process or in a negotiation reveals information. So on the one hand, if I kicked them out, they would be like, shit, those guys are serious. But then none of the other buyers would know about it because it's a sealed bid auction. They don't even know the existence of ServiceMaster. If I do let them in, then I have just signaled to them that, hey, they just reconfirmed their bid, and it's sufficient to get in, and maybe there's not as much competition as we think. And so as we talked about it, we ultimately decided to let them come to the meeting. And the reason why we decided that is I didn't want to lose a bidder. I relied on judgment, saying that even though I'm giving a potential signal to them that competition isn't as fierce and that I am not going to adhere to my own process rules, we were still running a really loose process at this point in time. And I thought I had more to lose by booting them out than keeping them in. And that's not always a decision I'll make, but from a fact-specific situation, it made sense to me. And it made sense to me because ServiceMaster was the one from the get-go telling management, no one can pay more. No one can pay more than us. No one creates more value. They were the ones that attempted to preempt the deal with a lousy offer, or what we viewed as a lousy offer. So I thought to myself, well, I don't see a whole lot of downside in keeping them in the process, allowing them to have the management meeting. And if this kind of activity continues, we'll just kick them in the teeth. So we had the meeting. Immediately after a management meeting, and pretty much any sort of process you're running, that's when you would ask acquirers to once again revise their bid forward. So they meet with management. We answer some questions. There might be some follow-up. It could be a few days later, a week later, 2 weeks later. But at some point shortly thereafter the management meeting, in order to stay in the race, they have to revise their bid. So that's what we did. And so thankfully, management was stellar. It was really a phenomenal performance by management. They did everything right, everything that I talked about in the first session of this series. And so we saw a huge jump in bids. The bids began to cluster at 1.75 to 1.8 billion SEK after the management meeting. So now we are getting into round 5. We, again, provided more information. We have the acquirers are not only negotiating the offers, but they're also negotiating the purchase agreement at this point in time. So we provided a draft of a purchase agreement. And it's important to do that because in a very competitive process, once you go into exclusivity with a single buyer, you lose a lot of leverage. And so in certain circumstances, we're going to be negotiating not only the broad terms like price and structure, but we're also going to be negotiating ancillary terms in the purchase agreement simultaneously. So we provided a draft of a purchase agreement and asked each buyer to have their attorney mark up that purchase agreement and then tender it to us along with their bid. And so we went to another round.